The wind came down from the Oregon Cascades like a warning, cold, sharp, and full of something that didn't belong. It whistled through brittle pine trees and scraped across the narrow gravel road that cut along the mountain shoulder. A single truck wound its way upward, tires crunching over frost-laced leaves, its faded red paint dulled by dust and time. Inside, Daisy Hayes sat quietly in the passenger seat, her small frame bundled in a sky-blue fleece jacket, 2 sizes too big. Her legs were wrapped in a flannel blanket, motionless beneath its folds. She stared out the window, not really seeing the landscape, just the blur of trees and mist and sky. Her face was pale, cheeks slightly hollow, with light brown hair pulled back into a braid that had begun to fray at the edges. In her arms, she clutched a threadbare stuffed rabbit, one ear missing, the other held on by a loose stitch. 8 months ago, Daisy had been a different child, bright-eyed, fast-talking, always asking questions. Then the accident took both her parents and left her spine shattered below the waist. Since then, she hadn't spoken much. She hadn't needed to. Most people didn't ask anything worth answering. The man driving the truck didn't speak either. Derek Hayes, Daisy's uncle and now legal guardian, gripped the wheel with knuckled fingers, his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. He was in his early 40s, wiry, with a face that looked carved from driftwood and eyes that never seemed to blink long enough to show what lived behind them. His beard was trimmed, but his fingernails were bitten down and raw. A heavy canvas jacket wrapped his torso, but cold still clung to his voice when he finally spoke. "We're almost there," he said flatly, not looking at her. "Best view in the whole county. You'll like it." Daisy didn't respond. She didn't move. If she could have chosen, she wouldn't be here. Not in this truck, not in these woods, not with this man. But choice had left her the same day her legs stopped working. Trailing the truck on foot was Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd with black and tan fur and a small scar above his left eye. His gait carried a slight limp from a fractured hip he'd suffered during a search and rescue operation 3 years earlier. Since Daisy's accident, Ranger had become her constant shadow, sleeping beside her bed, walking beside her chair, growling low whenever Derek raised his voice. Now as the truck rounded a bend, Ranger kept pace with quiet resolve, ears perked, eyes sharp. The trees thinned ahead, revealing a wide bluff that overlooked a sheer drop into a valley shrouded in fog. There were no guardrails here, just broken stones and tufts of dry grass, bent and brittle under the weight of the wind. The truck slowed, then stopped. Derek climbed out wordlessly and moved to the back, unlatched the tailgate, and hoisted Daisy's wheelchair down with practiced ease. Every motion he made was mechanical, detached, like this was just another chore to finish. He opened the passenger door and, without comment, lifted Daisy into the chair and adjusted the straps. Then he began pushing her toward the edge. The crunch of wheels over gravel was the only sound between them. Daisy's hands tightened around her blanket. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was thin and uncertain. "Uncle Derek, why are we stopping here?" He didn't answer at first. He knelt beside the chair, locked the brakes, and stood again, brushing off his gloves. His tone was low, almost too low to hear. "Thought you might want to see something beautiful." Daisy looked at the sky, gray and endless. Cold bit at her fingers through the blanket. "It's freezing," she whispered. "It won't take long." Behind them, Ranger froze. His ears pricked, his body tensed. Something in Derek's voice had changed, just enough for the dog to hear it, the chill that didn't come from weather. Daisy looked down. Only a few feet of loose gravel and dry earth stood between her and the cliff's edge. She swallowed. "Can we go back now?" Derek stood still for a long moment. Then he exhaled, slow and tight. His voice came like ice through the wind. "Sometimes, life gives you more weight than you can carry." He turned his back to her, and to the valley below. The wind pressed against the bluff like a living thing, curling around the pines and whistling through the brittle grass, carrying with it a weight Daisy couldn't name, but could feel deep in her chest. She sat motionless in her chair, bundled in a too large fleece, her fingers curled tightly around the edges of her blanket as if she could anchor herself to the earth through cloth alone. A strange stillness had settled over everything, the kind of quiet that arrives right before something breaks. Behind her, Uncle Derek stood like a statue carved from something cold. He didn't speak. He didn't kneel beside her again. He just stared out into the valley with that distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't really here anymore, or maybe had never truly been. The sky stretched above them, low and gray and heavy, and below the drop waited, silent, steep, and without mercy. Ranger, ever watchful, had stopped walking. His paws shifted over the gravel as he circled behind the wheelchair, his body tense, ears forward, a low growl humming in his throat like the soft thrum of a warning bell. Something about Derek's posture, his stillness, the way he gripped the handles of the chair without moving, it all made the air feel thinner, like even the mountain itself was holding its breath. "I want to go home," Daisy whispered, the words barely louder than the wind. Her voice trembled, but her eyes stayed forward. She was too afraid to look back. At last, Derek spoke, his voice low and hollow. "You know, your dad always thought he could fix anything. People, problems, life." He paused, letting the silence stretch between them. "But sometimes, some things are just too broken, too heavy." Daisy didn't understand his meaning completely, but the tone sent a chill down her spine far colder than the wind. She shifted slightly, trying to see his face, but he was already stepping behind her, hands resting on the back of the chair in a way that didn't feel steadying. It felt final. And then, without warning, the chair moved. It wasn't a push exactly. It was more like a release. The gravel slipped beneath the wheels, the weight of the chair pulling it forward toward the edge. Daisy's breath caught, a scream rising in her throat. But before it could escape, something else moved faster. A flash of black and gold fur shot from the side. Ranger in full charge. The dog slammed into the wheelchair with all the strength his body could gather, redirecting its path just enough to send it skidding sideways instead of forward. It hit a mess of thick roots and jagged stone. Toppling at an angle, the metal frame catching, stuck. Daisy screamed as the chair jolted and tilted, the world spinning, until the wheels locked into place and everything stopped just inches from the cliff's edge. Her chest heaved, her hands clutching the armrest so tightly her knuckles ached. Every breath hurt. Her body shook, not from cold, but from the terror that still clung to her like mist. Ranger stepped between her and Derek, his body low, rigid, eyes fixed on the man who stood frozen in disbelief. He didn't bark now, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to draw a line that no one would dare cross. Derek backed away. His face was unreadable, as if even he didn't know what he had become. He didn't speak, didn't justify, didn't show remorse. He simply turned and walked away, quietly, methodically, his boots crunching over gravel as he disappeared down the trail toward the truck. He never looked back, and he didn't run. The wind returned in his place, brushing past Daisy's cheeks like a hand too cold to comfort. Ranger let out a soft, wounded whine and moved closer, nudging Daisy's hand with his nose until her fingers found his fur and clenched it tight. "Don't leave me," she whispered, and Ranger stilled. He wouldn't. Time didn't break. It just bent, warped and strange, stretching itself into something unrecognizable as Daisy lay twisted in her wheelchair, half-tipped and wedged between two snarled roots at the edge of the cliff. Her breath came in a short, shallow burst, and every inch of her body ached from the sudden jolt, especially where the metal armrest bit into her ribs like a blade pressing without blood. She couldn't move. The straps across her lap, meant to keep her safe, had locked her in place. The pressure on her lower back was searing, and every attempt to shift brought a new wave of pain. Her legs, useless as ever, felt like heavy ghosts at the end of her body, present but unreachable. Above her, the sky had started to change. The light that had been dull and cold before was now fading fast, sinking into shades of iron blue and bruised gray. Pine branches swayed overhead, the tips of their needles brushing the wind like fingers, reaching for something that wouldn't come. And still, Ranger stayed. He hadn't moved far from her side, not since the moment he threw himself into the chair to save her life. Now he paced just behind her, his paws careful but restless, breath puffing in soft clouds each time he exhaled. The cold didn't seem to bother him, but the silence did. Every few minutes, he would stop, stand at attention, and glance down at her with those amber eyes, questioning, desperate to help, but not knowing how. Daisy blinked slowly, her throat dry and aching. "Ranger," she rasped, barely audible above the hiss of wind. "I'm still here." The dog's ears twitched, and he froze. A moment later, a low bark burst from his chest, sharp, urgent, and then another, higher in pitch. He moved to the edge of the bluff, stared out into the trees, and let loose a long, mournful howl that seemed to carry everything. The fear, the plea, the refusal to accept that help might never come. It echoed across the valley, bouncing off the stones, drifting down into the forest below. For a moment, the mountains answered with silence. Daisy pressed her forehead against the icy metal of the chair's armrest. The cold helped her stay awake. Memory came in flashes, her father's laugh, deep and rolling like summer thunder while flipping pancakes, her mother's voice, soft and melodic, reading bedtime stories with different voices for every character. She thought of birthdays, of riding a bike without training wheels, of Ranger climbing onto her hospital bed after the accident and curling up beside her as if to say, "I'm still here. You still have me. But what if now?" She didn't even have that. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see Ranger still standing sentinel, tail rigid, shoulders tense. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Don't stop calling. Someone will hear you." As if he understood, Ranger howled again, louder this time, and again. Each cry sharper, more insistent, as if he were tearing the air open to demand the world pay attention. Daisy closed her eyes. She imagined the sound slipping through the trees, sliding down gullies, curling across rooftops in the faraway town. She imagined it reaching ears that knew his voice. Miss Carter would hear, she thought. She had to. She always noticed what no one else did. But what if she didn't? The cold pressed in harder now, not just around her, but inside her. Her hands had begun to numb. Her lips cracked as she tried to wet them with a tongue that barely worked. Even her voice, when she tried to call for help again, came out as little more than a breath. Still, she wasn't alone. Ranger made sure of that. He walked over, sat beside her again, and gently nudged his head beneath her dangling hand until it rested atop his neck. His fur was thick and coarse, but warm. It grounded her. It kept her here. She leaned her head slightly, letting her cheek touch his back. Darkness didn't fall. It bled into the sky, slow and thick like ink spilling across a page. The sun had long slipped behind the ridges of the Cascades, leaving the forest wrapped in shadows and silver mist. The air grew sharper, more brittle, as if every breath Daisy took carved lines into her lungs. She had stopped trying to keep track of time. Minutes, maybe hours, had passed since Derek disappeared into the trees, taking whatever was left of warmth and light with him. Her body hurt everywhere now, ribs sore from the seat's edge, shoulders strained by the awkward tilt, arms numb from the cold and from clenching for too long. Her lower half, already without sensation, felt more foreign than ever, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Above her, the pine needles shivered, Below her, the cliff still waited, and beside her, Ranger stayed. He hadn't wandered far since his last howl, though he had paced like a soldier on duty, always alert, always watching. Now he sat curled at the base of the roots that held her wheelchair in place, his body pressed against hers as closely as the terrain allowed. His warmth seeped through the flannel of her blanket, subtle but life-saving. He nudged her hand again, gently, until her frozen fingers wrapped around a patch of fur near his collar. "I'm so tired," Daisy whispered, her voice thin and grainy like the wind itself. Ranger let out a soft whimper and licked the side of her wrist. She wanted to sleep. More than anything, she wanted to close her eyes and let it all slip away. The pain, the fear, the weight of what she could no longer do or change. But somewhere inside her, where memory still flickered like the last ember in a fire, she remembered something her mother had once said. "When you're too tired to keep going, you don't stop. You rest and let someone stand guard." So she rested, and Ranger guarded. Through the night, the temperature dropped further. Thin needles of rain began to fall, barely more than mist at first, but insistent, soaking into the flannel, into her hair, into the fabric of the blanket that could no longer keep out the cold. Ranger shook out his coat once, then lay back down, tail curled around his own paws, body tense but unmoving. Every so often, Daisy stirred, a twitch, a whisper. Once she murmured her mother's name, another time, just Ranger's. He answered with a small nudge, a paw against her boot, a quiet presence that never drifted. Sometime after midnight, a new sound broke the monotony of the wind, a low, aching cry in the distance. Ranger's ears twitched, head lifting. He stood, stared toward the trees, listening. Then he howled. Not as long this time, not as loud, but sharp, focused. And this time, far away, another sound answered him. It was faint, a creak, then a shuffle, a breath of motion in the trees. Ranger barked once, short and strong, and pressed his body close to Daisy's again, as if to say, "Someone's coming. I'll hold you until they do." Daisy didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, but her lips, cracked and dry, parted slightly in the cold, and she smiled. Back in the town of North Hollow, the night settled in with the kind of quiet that makes you think nothing is wrong. Houses glowed warmly behind curtained windows. Distant laughter drifted from open porches. But in the small cottage on the East Ridge, Evelyn Carter sat on her front steps with her coat wrapped tight around her and a cup of untouched tea cooling in her hands. She hadn't slept. Something was wrong. It wasn't anything loud. There'd been no phone call, no police siren, no knock at the door. Just absence. A silence where a child's presence used to be. Daisy Hayes, who had missed the last 2 days of class without notice, wasn't the kind of girl who disappeared quietly. Even after the accident, even when words were hard for her to find, she still showed up. And Evelyn noticed when children stopped showing up. She always had. She tilted her head toward the forest behind her house. That's when she heard it, faint but distinct. A howl, not a coyote, not wild. Too steady, too mournful. She stood slowly, heart hitching in her chest. Her cabin overlooked a wooded gorge across from the old fire access road, a path Derek Hayes was known to use when he claimed Daisy needed fresh air. Evelyn had been to Derek's house once, an uninvited visit to drop off school supplies. She'd seen the way he looked through people instead of at them, the way he spoke with too smooth answers and too little concern. There had always been rumors about debts, about gambling, but no proof, until maybe now. She didn't know where the howl came from exactly, but it hadn't come from nothing, and the tea in her hands had gone cold. Evelyn moved. Inside, she dialed the school's voicemail. "This is Ms. Carter. Please tell Mrs. Grayson I won't be in tomorrow. Something's come up." She packed a flashlight, a spare jacket, and a map of the ridge trail she hadn't touched since her father died. Then she stepped into boots older than her teaching license and grabbed her keys. But before she left, she paused. That sound, it echoed again. Not frantic, not random, calling. The next morning, long before the sun rose, Evelyn stood outside Derek Hayes' cabin. The front porch sagged under her weight, and the windows were dark. No truck in the driveway. No signs of anyone home. She knocked, waited. Nothing. She tried the door. It opened. Inside, it smelled of smoke and damp pine. The living room was sparse. One worn couch, an empty fireplace, and a coffee mug on the table, half dried as if someone left in a hurry. She moved through the cabin like someone afraid to see what they already knew. In the bedroom, she found it. Daisy's backpack, unzipped and slumped beside the bed. Her school notebook still inside. A folder marked week of October 12th. Her red jacket, the one she never left the house without, hung limply from the closet doorknob. Worse still, her wheelchair folded neatly against the wall. Clean, unused. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She backed out of the room, nearly stumbling, and fumbled for her phone. "Grant," she said when the sheriff answered, "you need to get out here, now." By the time Sheriff Grant Miles pulled up, the early fog was just beginning to lift. Evelyn met him in the yard, holding something in shaking hands. A partially burned stack of documents she found near the fire pit. Letters from the state guardianship office. A copy of Marcus and Julia Hayes' will. The parts not blackened were enough to read: Daisy Hayes, beneficiary, guardianship revocable. She was never safe with him, Evelyn said, her voice cracking for the first time. Grant's face darkened. "You said you heard a howl?" She nodded. "From the ridge across the basin. It wasn't wild, it was calling." Grant turned slowly toward the trees. "Then let's go find who's calling back." The morning light in North Hollow came hesitant and gray, crawling low across the treetops like it was unsure if it should disturb the silence. Fog clung to the valley floor, heavy as breath held too long. Sheriff Grant Miles stood on the hood of his SUV, a pair of long-range binoculars braced against his brow, scanning the opposite ridge. His expression was still, but his eyes were moving fast, searching for something that made sense of the knot in his chest. Beside him, Evelyn Carter stood with arms folded tight, her coat barely enough to hold back the chill. She hadn't said much since he arrived. She didn't need to. The evidence had spoken. The burned papers, the untouched backpack, the empty folded wheelchair. And then there was the howl. She had described it with the kind of certainty that only comes from someone who knows a voice even when it belongs to a dog. "Wait," Grant muttered. "I see movement." He adjusted the focus. Through the misty break in the trees, far on the bluff across the basin, a dark shape paced near the cliff's edge. Not a shadow. It moved too deliberately. The size, the color, a flash of golden black fur. "Ranger," Evelyn said under her breath. Grant passed her the binoculars. Her heart leapt into her throat. There he was, Ranger, pacing, turning, stopping, then barking toward the trees as if pleading for someone to see. "Stay here," Grant said. "I'll hike in." "I'm coming with you," Evelyn replied immediately. "No," he said firmly, lowering his voice. "You're needed here. If we find something, someone, I'll call it in. But if Daisy's out there, we can't risk spooking Derek. Not yet." She hesitated, jaw tight, but then nodded. "Be careful." Grant moved fast, climbing into the back of the SUV and pulling out a small pack, a medical kit, rope, and a walkie-talkie. He knew these woods well, had tracked lost hikers and broken-footed hunters across them more than once. But something about this felt different, urgent, raw. This wasn't just rescue. This was a reckoning. He took the fire trail that curled along the eastern slope, his boots sinking into damp earth as the mist thickened. The deeper he went, the quieter everything became. Just the creak of pine boughs, the rush of blood in his ears, and the faint echo of memory. In another life, he learned to follow sound through chaos, through war zones and wildfire. Now he was following a dog's voice and a teacher's instinct. Halfway up the ridge, a second figure stepped out of the trees, tall, broad, dressed in a faded green jacket patched at the elbows, with a coiled rope slung across one shoulder. Pete Harmon, a former climbing instructor who lived off-grid just outside of town. Pete was the kind of man who rarely spoke unless words had weight. He nodded once. "Emma called," he said. "Said you'd need hands. I brought gear." Grant didn't ask how he found him so fast. Some people just knew where to go when it mattered. "There's a girl," Grant said. "Daisy Hayes, 9, paralyzed. Ranger's up there with her." Pete's expression didn't change, but his pace quickened. They hiked in silence, their footfalls muffled by the wet forest floor. The fog was beginning to thin now, peeling back in strips, and the wind whispered through the branches like something beginning to stir. When they crested the last rise, Ranger appeared from behind a thick outcrop of stone, his coat soaked, his eyes wide and wild with urgency. The German shepherd barked sharply, then turned and darted back toward the edge of the bluff. Pete and Grant followed, and then they saw her. Daisy was slumped in her wheelchair, tangled in tree roots and crumbling rock, tilted hard to one side, her face pale and lips faintly blue. One arm hung limp. Her eyes were barely open. Grant felt something hollow punch through his chest. "She's alive," he said, "but barely." Pete was already unpacking the rope. "We don't have time to wait for a chopper," he said. "We go now." Ranger stayed near the cliff's edge, tail stiff, body trembling, but he didn't whine. He didn't bark again. He just watched. "Ready?" The wind whipped harder now, scraping along the cliffside like knives through brittle bark. Rain had begun to fall, thin and needling, soaking through jackets, gloves, and every breath that dared to come too shallow. Sheriff Grant Miles stood a few feet from the drop, speaking low into his walkie-talkie, requesting emergency medical backup at the trailhead. Then he stepped aside. Pete Harmon was already on his knees near the edge, working with quiet surgical focus. His rope was thick, worn from years of use, but double-checked and coiled with precision. Carabiners clicked softly in the wind as he assembled the harness, his fingers moving fast. Sure, this wasn't the first time he'd looked over a cliff and seen death waiting below. He didn't intend to let it win today. "Anchor's solid," he muttered, tying off to a boulder wedged deep in the ground. "I'll go first. Gotta assess the chair's stability before we try moving her." Grant gave a firm nod. "Take it slow." Pete glanced at Ranger, who stood at his side now, soaked but steady, ears twitching at every sound. "You've done your part, soldier," Pete said under his breath. Ranger didn't move, just stared at the girl down below, unblinking. With the gear secured, Pete leaned back into the harness, boots planted against the wet rock as he began his descent. The wind caught at his coat, tugging like fingers trying to pull him away. His hands gripped the rope tightly as he moved downward, one slow inch at a time. 15 feet below, Daisy hung in the half-collapsed cradle of roots and broken stone, her wheelchair tilted at an angle that looked impossible to maintain. Pete reached her, planting one foot on a narrow outcrop and the other braced against a branch. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from urgency. He placed 2 fingers gently against her neck. "Breathing?" he called up. "Weak pulse. She's freezing." Daisy stirred at his touch. Her eyelids fluttered open just enough for the gray light to catch them. Pete leaned in, lowering his voice. "Hey there, sweetheart. You're doing just fine. My name's Pete. I'm gonna get you out of here, okay?" Her lips trembled. A sound came out, barely audible, no louder than the wind. "Ranger?" Pete's eyes softened. "Yeah," he said, glancing upward. "He's here." Right above you. Hasn't moved a muscle." A single tear slipped down Daisy's cheek and mixed with the rain. Pete moved quickly now. The chair was wedged between two jagged rocks and a twisted pine root. Stable for the moment, but barely. He unstrapped a canvas sling from his pack and began working it beneath her torso. Every movement was slow, deliberate, a whisper of motion that wouldn't shift the balance. Above, Grant had already lowered a second rope, along with an emergency blanket and warming pack. Pete didn't look up. He just worked, securing Daisy's chest, then her arms, whispering to her every few seconds, letting her know she wasn't alone. Then came the hardest part. "Daisy," he said gently, his voice tightening, "I need to take you out of the chair for a minute, okay? Just a minute. I've got you." Her head moved faintly, the smallest nod. Pete reached around, released the main buckle. For a split second, everything went still, and then the chair slipped. The frame cracked against the rock, tumbled once, then vanished down the cliff with a terrible, hollow clang. Daisy cried out, her voice raw and quick. But Pete already had her, arms locked tight across her back, holding her against his chest. "It's gone," he said, "but you're safe. I've got you." He shifted his weight carefully, cinched the second rope around both of them, and gave a signal to Grant. The pull began. Above them, Ranger barked, short, sharp, and insistent, with every inch gained. His paws paced the edge, back and forth, as if willing the rope upward. Rain blurred everything. The rock was slick. The climb was slow. But finally, Pete's hand crested the edge. Grant reached down and took Daisy first, lifting her gently onto the ground. Her body trembled against his coat, but her breathing was steady, her eyes half opened, then focused. "Ranger," she whispered. The dog moved at once, pressing his nose against her cheek, tail wagging low and slow. Daisy's hand found his fur and stayed there, unmoving but alive. Pete climbed over the ledge seconds later, panting, soaked and shaking, not from fear but from the adrenaline slowly draining from his limbs. "She's okay," he breathed. "She's here." Grant wrapped his coat tighter around Daisy as the sound of distant sirens echoed faintly through the trees. "We've got you now, sweetheart," he said. Ranger settled beside her, pressing into her side as if to say, "I always did." The lights in the recovery room were soft, casting a pale golden sheen across the white hospital sheets. Machines beeped in steady rhythms, measuring life in the quietest of ways. Daisy Hayes lay nestled beneath a heated blanket, her cheeks flushed faintly from warmth, but her eyes still rimmed with fatigue. The worst of the hypothermia had passed. The bruises on her arms had been cleaned, the scratch across her temple stitched and bandaged. She hadn't spoken much since the rescue, not until now. Sitting at her bedside was Evelyn Carter, still wearing the same jacket from the night before, her red curls falling loose from their pins. She held Daisy's hand gently, her thumb tracing slow, comforting circles across the back of the child's knuckles. At the foot of the bed, Sheriff Grant Miles stood with a clipboard tucked under one arm. Beside him was a woman in a long dark coat with a badge clipped discreetly to her belt. Marianne Rowe, child welfare investigator. Her expression was firm but not unkind. Grant leaned in slightly. "Daisy," he said, voice low, "I know it's hard, but if you feel ready, we need to know what happened." Daisy looked past him for a moment, to the window where the first light snowfall was starting to dust the world in silence. Then her gaze shifted to her right, where Ranger lay with his head resting on the bed, never more than a few inches away. "I didn't want to go," she said softly, her voice raw. "Uncle Derek said he wanted to show me something. A view." Her fingers tightened around Evelyn's. "We stopped at the cliff. I asked why. He said something about my dad, about being broken." She swallowed. Then he let go. He didn't try to stop the chair. He just watched. Marianne was already taking notes. Evelyn reached up, brushed a strand of hair from Daisy's forehead. "You're safe now," she whispered. Grant stepped forward, holding out a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a bent metal latch, a seatbelt buckle from the wheelchair. "We found this where you were stuck," he said. "It was jammed shut, forced that way. You couldn't have undone it even if you tried." Daisy didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just looked at Ranger, then back at the sheriff and said, "I knew he wouldn't let go. Not Ranger." And no one in the room doubted her. Outside, the day was already breaking, and somewhere deep in the pines, justice was stirring. The arrest happened just after dawn. The road to Derek Hayes' cabin was still half covered in frost, the gravel crackling beneath the tires of 3 sheriff's cruisers. Sheriff Grant Miles stepped out first, his canvas jacket pulled tight against the cold, the morning sun barely warming the treetops. Behind him, 2 deputies fanned out in practiced silence. Derek opened the cabin door before they even knocked. He stood in jeans and a thermal shirt, a cup of black coffee in hand, steam rising from it like the last remnants of a lie. "What's this?" he asked flatly, though his eyes flickered with something that tried to be control, but came out as fear. Grant didn't waste time. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and falsification of guardianship documents." For one long second, Derek didn't move. Then his hand twitched, barely, and Grant caught it. "Don't," he said. The handcuffs clicked closed with the finality of a chapter ending. As they led him away, Derek turned his head once toward the trees. Not toward the town, not toward Daisy, but toward nothing. Like a man realizing too late that no one was watching his fall. He didn't ask about Daisy. He didn't speak again. 2 days later, in a hospital room filled with sun and silence, Daisy sat propped up against fresh pillows, Ranger's head resting gently across her lap. His eyes followed every movement in the room, ears twitching with each beep from the monitors. He hadn't left her side once, not for food, not for rest. As if the moment he had stepped away, she might disappear. Evelyn Carter stood by the window, watching snow melt in soft patterns along the sill. In her hands, she held a brown folder just delivered from the county clerk's office. Guardianship confirmed. Full legal custody. Daisy Hayes was no longer a ward of the state. She was Evelyn's daughter now, not by blood, but by every act that ever mattered. Evelyn turned and met Daisy's eyes. "He's not coming back," she said gently. Daisy nodded, her fingers curling tighter in Ranger's fur. "I know." A pause passed between them, soft and safe. Then Daisy asked, "Do we still get to live in the cabin?" Evelyn smiled. "Not just live. We get to begin." The cabin on Red Fern Ridge was never meant to be permanent, but it became something more. Nestled among tall pines and wrapped in the scent of cedar, the cabin overlooked a meadow that turned gold in late spring and silver in the moonlight. Evelyn made it theirs. Every ramp, every door frame widened, every shelf within reach. Daisy's room faced east, so the light found her every morning before anything else did. One afternoon, when the rain had cleared and birds returned to the feeders, Daisy wheeled herself slowly across the porch, Ranger walking beside her with quiet dignity. She paused near the edge, took in the sound of the wind moving gently through the branches, and whispered, "It's quiet here." Evelyn sat beside her, mug in hand. "Do you like it?" "I do," Daisy said, then softer. "It doesn't feel temporary." "It's not," Evelyn replied. "This is home, for as long as you want it." Ranger let out a soft thuff, pressing his head gently against Daisy's knee. She laughed for the first time in weeks. In the months that followed, something beautiful began to grow. What started as quiet homeschooling in the cabin's kitchen turned into something more. Evelyn began inviting other children who had fallen through the cracks. Kids in wheelchairs, kids who'd lost too much. Kids like Daisy, with unspoken scars and hearts still learning to trust again, they sat in a circle beneath the trees with journals and sketchbooks, and sometimes just silence. Ranger became a fixture, lying beside each child like a blanket with eyes. He didn't bark. He didn't beg. He just stayed. He always stayed. One day, a girl with a hearing aid and bruises on her wrists asked, "Is Ranger a real therapy dog?" Daisy smiled, closed her journal, and answered, "No, he's better." On the porch of the cabin, a framed photograph sat above the windowsill. In it, Daisy grinned, still pale, still healing, but alive in a way that light can't fake. Evelyn stood behind her, arms gently on her shoulders. And at her feet, eyes bright, coat thick, stood Ranger. The caption below read, "Not all angels have wings. Some have 4 paws and never look away." And when Daisy lay in bed at night, warm beneath layers of soft quilts, Ranger curled beside her like he always had. One hand rested on his back, rising and falling with each breath. "Promise me you'll never leave," she would whisper. And Ranger never answered, because he didn't need to. Outside the window, dawn returned like a promise, not loud, not sudden, but certain. And somewhere beyond the pines, the world waited, softer now and finally safe.